Can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. So let's get started. So first I'm going to talk about the midterm exam. So the midterm exam is this Friday at 8 a.m. sharp. So the exam will be open between 8 a.m. and 8:30, but I want you to start it at 8, okay? Once you're in, you'll get 2 hours to complete it. So make sure you're up bright and early Friday morning, 8 a.m. The test will be 2 hours in length, which I think will be a reasonable amount of time. My camera here isn't set up. So it'll be 2 hours in length. So you should have more than enough time. There's 40 multiple choice questions. So you'll have more than 2 minutes each. The multiple choice questions will be a rough balance of knowledge base and application. So the application will include, anything from a graph, calculation, that sort of thing, where knowledge base are just testing whether you understand a concept or know the definition of a concept, okay? And these are coming from pools of similar questions, so everyone's going to get a slightly different test, but the questions will be very similar, but just a bit different. And it will cover chapters 3 to 7. And yes, so the rule of 70 is a possibility for being on there, of course. So anything in the chapters 3 to 7 is fair game, although I usually will target things I specifically cover in the lecture notes. But you should be reading the chapters. You have lots of practice questions to do. So we have the ones we do in the lecture. I would highly suggest doing the questions at the end of each chapter. The solutions are posted. And there's also, if you go into Connect, there's some practice self-check quizzes there. And you also have on Slate, I have some exam practice problems you can do, and they all have solutions. So you definitely want to be doing as much practice as you can. And again, it'll cover chapters 3 to 7. So this rule of 70 question, about rule of 70, will there be possibilities that answers could vary based on there shouldn't be. If there is, you can email me after. I think the proper way is to use 70. So just do 70 divided by the percent, okay? And okay, so the exam is located under quizzes. I'll actually go into Slate and make sure you know where it is. So can you see the Slate screen?
Yeah, I see.
Perfect. So you're going to go under assessments, and you're going to see this mandatory practice quiz. You shouldn't be able to see these yet. This, you don't get any grades for. You just need to go in and do it to be able to make sure that the lockdown browser works. Okay? And actually, if you don't go in and do the practice quiz, you won't be able to access the midterm because this has release conditions. This won't get released until you do that. There's just some random questions in here. It doesn't matter how you answer them. It's just to test the browser, okay? So you need to do this after the lecture tonight. Just get it out of the way, and so you're ready to go into your midterm exam on Friday morning, okay? So let's go back to the PowerPoint. If you have any technical issues, don't waste time emailing me. There's nothing I can help you with. I don't work for the Respondus Lockdown Browser Company, so there's only so much I can do. I've found a link that specifically goes to where you can submit a support ticket. So use this link if you get into any issues, okay? And finally, make sure you attend the exam on Friday morning at 8 a.m. If you're really sick and sick enough to get a doctor's note, you need to write the test, okay? So I'll only accept a doctor's note if you absolutely need to write a deferred exam. So I'll open it up to any questions and see. So someone's asking already, gross mixed income was in the practice questions, but I don't think we were taught how it's calculated in class. Oh yes, don't worry about just worry about what's in the lecture slides with regards to the calculating the GDP using the expenditures and income approach. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, yep. You can ask them. You can turn on your mic and ask the question if you want, Paulina. If that's quicker than writing both of them. Yep.
Yeah, that's much quicker. Can you hear me?
Yep. I could hear you.
It's just about, so the first question is for the chapter 4, when you went through in the PowerPoint presentation, when you went through the active learning, the first example that you went through, hold on, I don't have it in front of me. Oh, I do, 1 second. So it asks about where it says the unemployment rate in an economy is 7.5%, and then it gives us the total population. It says the labor force is 180 million. I try to do the calculations, but I can't seem to get the answer, C, 166.5 million.
Okay, let me I can bring that up now.
Okay. And then I have one more question after this. So I'll go on mute.
Sure.
And I'll ask once you're finished.
Okay, so this was active learning.
I've been on the second slide, I believe, right at the top. No, not the second, the third, the fourth. Oh, no, the seventh.
This one, yeah.
Yeah, so just the one on the left where it's 166.5. I can't see.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so what we need to do here is, I'll open up a little Excel spreadsheet. Can you see the Excel spreadsheet and the lecture slides? Hello, anyone there?
We can see it.
Okay. All right. So the first thing we're told is the unemployment rate. Okay. And then we're told the total population, and then we're told the labor force. Now, what I'm after is the number of people employed. Okay. So we know the labor force is equal to those that are employed plus those that are unemployed, right? So if I'm able to figure out what U is and LF, then I know what E is, right? We know that the labor force is 180 million. Okay. Now, how do we get the number of people unemployed? We take 0.075 and we multiply that by the labor force, and then we get 13.5. Okay. So then employment then is just equal to the labor force. The number of people employed is equal to the labor force minus those who are unemployed. And so the answer is 166.5. Does that make sense?
Yes. No, that's good. And then the other one was, it's actually in the textbook. It's the textbook question. If you go to the end where it has the study guide, so it's pretty much the table that gives us nominal, real GDP, the deflator, but it asks for, sorry, I would have to bring it up. I can't see it.
Actually, you know what, for that one, maybe just probably it's best if you could just take a screenshot of it and then email it to me, and then I could just send you an email back with what's going on to clarify. Or if I get before the end of the lecture, I can do it at the end of the lecture, and then everyone can see what the issue was and everything. So it's up to you. Yeah, does it sound good to you?
Yeah, we can do it at the end. I think it'll be really fast. It's just a calculation for one of the lines is empty, but we didn't do it as an example. So I was just wondering how to find. I think it was like nominal GDP, but it didn't give us two of the other ones, and we had to figure it out. I just didn't know how to do it because we didn't cover it. It'll be like a couple seconds. It'll be fast. We can do it after.
Perfect. Yeah. It'll take me a little bit of time to get the textbook open and all that. So yeah, it's probably better if you just send me a screenshot.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do that while you're going through the lecture so that we can just have it.
Yeah, and if I forget by the end, just remind me.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
So one of the other questions was someone asked about the formula sheet. So I forgot to mention that. Yes, I've emailed you the formula sheet. So you have it. You should have it now in your email. And so you can print that out and use that during the test. So the test is supposed to be closed book. I mean, it's obviously I can't monitor that, but I wouldn't suggest trying to learn the material during the test because, you only have a certain amount of time and you have to answer all the questions. So you have a formula sheet there. So, that it's closed book, but, again, I can't enforce that. So you take that for what it is. But there's no time for you to be looking up stuff that you don't know. So you need to study. So, okay. So I'll just check if there's any other questions here. Someone says the online textbook has errors. I don't know what to say about that. Yeah, I've never had anyone mention that yet. complete. So, Michelle, are you trying to say that are you talking about the specific question that Paulina had, or you can? So, thanks for letting me know. If you want to send me an email, let me know where the errors are. What the issue is. Some more specifics that would be perfect. And so now, Bella is asking, how do I know which question I did wrong in a quiz? You should be able to go into Connect. I think it's after the due date, so it would be after the class. You should be able to go into results and see the specifics. Just go in there now and I'll check. It's a bit slow. So feedback's held for 1 hour after due date. Okay. So you won't get any feedback till an hour. So, the quiz was due now at 5 p.m. So you should be able to see your answers at 6 p.m. But I think you have to go, you'll have to go into Connect, and I'm not exactly sure, but I think I don't know what it looks like on your end. I'm pretty sure it's different, but I think there's some option for results beside the quiz or something like that. And then you'll be able to see the results. Okay. Let me know if that doesn't work out, because I'll check it. But given what I've just saw in terms of what policy settings I have, it should show up for you. Okay. And then again, while I'm in Connect, I'll remind you that there are some practice questions here that you can do for the midterm. You even have a math review if you want to do that. You don't need to do chapter 2, but you have chapter 3, 4, 5, which is down here for some reason, 6 and 7. Oh yeah, there was an issue with this, I think, last week. We emailed them and they said they fixed it. So it looks like it's working now. So, okay. So any other questions? Okay, so let's get started. I think it's a little shorter of a lecture today. I didn't want to overwhelm you before the midterm. So we're going to talk about fiscal policy. So fiscal policy, when you think of the word fiscal policy, think of taxes and spending. So it's basically the government's approach to its spending and taxation. So fiscal policy is the use of government's taxing and spending powers to manage the behavior of the economy, because they don't need to spend all of the money they take in, and they can also spend more than the amount of money they take in through taxes, because they can borrow. And so they can use this to stimulate or destimulate the economy. The Department of Finance is the government department. This is the federal government I'm talking about, that is responsible for fiscal policy. And they claim that their purpose is to ensure a healthy Canadian economy, but by developing policies of sound economic management and providing expert advice to the government. So the Minister of Finance brings down an annual budget in Parliament each spring. So this budget has mainly an outline of what it's going to spend and what it's going to take in revenue. So it's projected revenues. It doesn't know exactly, but it has a good idea of how much it will collect. The current Minister of Finance is Bill Morneau. And so every year this budget is presented by the government, but it's presented to Parliament. That's one thing to point out, and it needs to be passed by Parliament. And what's in the budget is the spending projections, the expected government revenue, and then economic forecast for the upcoming year. Okay, so they're usually released in February or March before the start of the fiscal year. And this allows some time for the provinces who do a similar thing to have their budgets done afterwards, because the provinces rely on money from the federal government. So they wait to know how much they're going to get from the federal government before they do their own budgets. And it needs to be voted on and passed by the House of Commons. So if you have if the government doesn't have a majority government, there's a chance it might not pass. And if it doesn't pass, the government can fall. So anyways, that's a little more into the realm of political science. But the idea here is that there's basically an accounting for the spending and taxation or revenue generation of the government every year. It's in the form of a budget, so it just basically outlines how much they're going to spend, how much they're going to take in, and it needs to get passed in order to be implemented. So this is an overview of some of the items that we're talking about here. So this is the federal government budget for the fiscal year ending March 2016. So in terms of revenue, the largest category is personal income taxes. So this is where the government in Canada obtains most of its revenues. Okay, so that was $142 billion. Then we have corporate and other income taxes. We got EI premiums, GST and other taxes, and other sort of non-tax revenues. So kind of miscellaneous things. Expenses. So one of the biggest expense is transfers to persons. So this is money from the federal government that is paid out to people on unemployment insurance or pensions, other forms of social assistance. Then spending grants to the other levels of provinces. And then there's public debt charges. So this is interest on the debt that the federal government already has acquired. So in 2016, they paid $25 billion in interest charges. And then direct program spending. So if they're federal highway or something like that, that would be in this category here. So for 2016, we had revenues of $291 billion and expenses of $296 billion. And so we had a budget deficit of $5.4 billion. So let's look at some definitions. So net tax revenue is total tax revenue received by the government less transfer payments. So actually, if we go back here, we can see that the government took in a bunch of tax revenue, right? From, if you think of households, the people in the economy and on the whole, it takes money in from some households, but then gives it back to other households. So net tax revenue is just the net after we work that out. So how much did the government take in total after it does this redistribution? So you can think of a lot of taxes are from higher income people. These are lower income people. So as a whole, the government's taking a lot of money, but then giving some of it right back to other people, right? And so net tax revenue is just the total taxes received or the net tax received after transfer payments. So after they give money to people on EI and pensions and other things. A budget surplus is, of course, if they took in more revenue than they spent. So if the net tax revenue is in excess of government spending on goods and services, we have a budget surplus. And it can happen. It's happened. It doesn't happen too often, but it does. A budget deficit is the opposite. It's in a particular year if they spent more than what they took in. National debt, then, of course, is the sum of the federal government's budget deficits less its surpluses up to that point. Okay? And a balanced budget is the term for when the government spends the same amount as it takes in tax revenue. So I just put a summary slide here where all of these are laid out for you to have. So net tax revenue is tax revenue minus transfer payments. A balanced budget is when net tax revenue is, the budget balance is just what the balance is. Think of at any particular time, if I take net tax revenues minus government spendings, that'll give me what the budget balance is, okay? So it's the difference between net tax revenues and government spending. That's different from a balanced budget. If we say balanced budget, that means these two things are equal. Again, national debt is just the sum of all prior deficits less its surpluses. A balanced budget is when these two things are equal, as I said. Budget surplus is when net tax revenues are greater than government spending, and a budget deficit is when net tax revenue is less than government spending. Okay, everyone good with that? So let's look at some interesting data. So this is the federal deficits and surpluses from 1966 to 2014. This should be updated soon. And we can see that the baby boomer generation left us a lot of debt, because if you look pretty much every year since the early 70s, federal government was in a deficit position, and the deficits were quite large. So all these deficits added up to quite a large debt, especially relative to GDP in the mid-1990s. And at this point, the federal government had to drastically cut government spending. There was, it wasn't a happy time for people who worked for the government in this period. And then afterwards, they were able to run surpluses for a number of years. And then we had the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and things improved. We had a bit of deficits lately, but nothing too serious. And then if you can imagine now with COVID, we're going to have one of the largest deficits ever. So some people are projecting. So just to summarize up to this point, so deficits was a permanent feature in the 70s and 80s. We finally got some surpluses, and then the financial crisis. And then I'm going to have to, show now so at the time, this was considered a big deal, $56 billion deficit. And, that was quite large. And that was because of the financial crisis. That's this number here. Now, with COVID, it's projected that the deficit this year will be negative 252 billion. So that's, basically the government is picking up the slack for every restaurant worker, every person who lost their job. They're getting, a certain portion, which is quite high, of their lost income. So, this is quite substantial. So the economic statistics that are going to be coming out in the next year are going to be very interesting, to say the least. So we're definitely not going to be in a situation of surpluses for a while, and we're going to be contributing substantially to the overall national debt. This is what the debt looked like from 1980 to 2015. So in 2015, the federal debt was around $612 billion. And you can see if we had, data from the 1970s, we would see it was continuously growing then. And this is just growing because of all the deficits that we had each year. Then in the mid-1990s, they slashed and cut spending and were able to generate surpluses, and they used some of the surpluses to pay back the debt. And so we see that the debt fell. And then after the financial crisis, it went back up. And now it's going to go up quite high because of COVID-19. So changes in the economy have an impact on government revenue. For example, growth in the economy has a positive effect on revenue. So if there's economic growth, positively affects the amount of revenues that the government is going to take in. So that's the net tax revenue. And the main reason for that is if the economy is growing, the better the economy, the more taxes the government's going to be able to collect, and the less amount of transfer payments it would have to make. So there'll be less employment insurance claims or any other social assistance claims. On the other hand, a recession does the opposite. In a recession, you have people losing their jobs, businesses not making as much profit or shutting down. So the government is taking in less tax revenue. And at the same time, they're going to have to pay out more for social assistance programs, and so transfer payments will also increase. So we can see that net tax revenue and GDP are directly related. There's a positive relationship. The higher the GDP, the higher the net tax revenue. So we can represent this relationship on a graph. In this first panel here, we have government spending and net tax revenue. Okay, so here we're just going to assume government spending is fixed. So let's just assume government spending is fixed at some level. Okay. And then this is our net tax revenues. So the idea here is that real GDP, or the economy's income, is positively related to net tax revenues. Okay. And so for a fixed amount of government spending, so in this example here, we have a deficit, the beginning here all the way up to this point here, because to the left of this point, government spending is higher than net tax revenues. So you could think of maybe this as being a recession or something like that, where real GDP is lower, or maybe think of real GDP having fell like it has now because of COVID-19. And so the deficit, so you're more likely to be in a deficit situation if real GDP is low compared to when it's high. And in this particular example, in the center of the diagram, this is the level of real GDP where what the government takes in is equal to what the government spends. Okay. And then to the right of that, we have a surplus. We have surplus situations. Okay, so we're just looking at the difference between net tax revenue and government spending. We're looking at them separately in this graph. The graph below simply just combines them and plots the budget balance. So remember, the budget balance was just net tax revenue minus government spending. So that's what this budget line is. So we know in the center it should be equal to 0, right? Because net tax revenue is equal to government spending. Well, if we look down, we see that, yes, it is indeed at 0. So at point C, the budget line is telling us that the budget would be balanced. If we go to the right, we have a surplus. And so the net tax revenue minus government spending will be equal to the amount of the surplus. Okay? And then here, deficit. So there's not much difference between these two figures, but here we're just basically showing the budget line. I mean, they're going to move in the same direction because government spending's fixed. So the only thing that's increasing here when the economy increases, so when real GDP increases, the only thing that's increasing is the net tax revenue. So that the budget balance is going to increase by exactly the same amount because it's just always subtracting that fixed government spending. Okay, so let's see here. So if we look at real GDP of Y2, we have a balanced budget. So I mentioned that already. That's because net tax revenues will equal G. So this will occur when the budget line crosses the 0 axis. Y3, here we have a surplus because the net tax revenue exceeds government spending. And at Y1, there is a lower real GDP, taxes, and a budget deficit. So the government budget is affected by various things. It is affected by the level of GDP, although here we've just drawn it to not change at all with real GDP, but it could change. So we can, if the government spending were to increase, we would just shift up this line to a higher level. And so the point or level of real GDP at which the economy will have a balanced budget will now be at a higher level. In this example, it would now be Y2 instead of Y1. Okay, so when you shift this up, it's going to shift down the budget line. And the reason why it shifts the budget line down is because the budget line is just measuring net tax revenues minus government spending. Well, we've just increased spending, so now we're subtracting off a larger number. So the budget line will be lower. Okay, and again, the new point where the budget would be balanced would be right here with a real GDP of Y2. Okay, so this is pretty simple. Let's see if you guys can get this. So we have that the government has autonomous spending of 50 million, we can say. And the net tax revenues are given by this table. So remember, net tax revenues moves with real GDP, and there's a positive relationship. So this is just an example. So here, when real GDP is 0, that's net tax revenues. When it's 160, this is our net tax revenues. And so the question is just asking us to complete the table and plot the corresponding budget line, and then graph the net tax revenue and real GDP. So if government spending is fixed at 50 and real GDP is 0, what would the budget balance be? It would be, negative 30. We are going to spend 50, but only take in 20 in net tax revenues. So our budget balance will be negative 30. And then if we're at 40, we'll take in this much, but spend 50, so it'll be negative 20, and so on. Only at a level of real GDP of 160 will we be able to have a surplus. If we were to plot this, we have that at 120, we have our balanced budget. So we know that the budget line should go through that point. This is all surplus. This is all deficits. Okay, so let's talk about the Great Depression and the macro adjustment process. So we did touch on this before. So before the Great Depression, most economists thought market adjustments would direct an economy back to full employment rather quickly. This is because wages and prices would adjust. So if we have unemployment, then labor at a certain wage, the amount of labor that firms want to hire is less than the amount of people who want to work at that wage. And so one way for labor demand and the amount of, well, it's mostly labor demand to increase would be to have a lower wage. So if the wage is lower, that would cause firms to want to hire a bit more. And so that should happen until unemployment is eliminated. There's a lot of more complicated things going on there, but in theory, that would be what would have been expected prior to the Great Depression. The problem is the Great Depression's length and severity changed these views. The unemployment rate in the Great Depression was something about like 25%, and that lingered for almost a decade, even 10 years. So a decade later, the unemployment rate was still something like 17%. So clearly, the theory wasn't really correct in this case. Something was going on that wasn't explained in the theory. And the obvious candidates are that wages weren't adjusting quickly. So again, these are just some of the stats from the Great Depression. So, between 1929 and 1933, real GDP fell by more than 30%. 1933, we had a 25% unemployment rate, basically in Canada and the US. And in 1939, so that's quite a while later, it was a decade after the initial stock market crash, the unemployment rate was still 17%, and per capita income was virtually the same as a decade earlier. So clearly, the economy wasn't adjusting quickly. So Keynesian, John Maynard Keynes, came up with a new model, and the main idea was that there's a short-run equilibrium. So we learned this before, and he's basically saying firms will produce the amounts of goods and services they believe people plan to buy, which makes sense. And so when you're in a recession, you have depressed incomes, and so people are going to be buying less. And so firms are going to be producing less. Why would they produce more than what people want to buy? And so we could have this, and again, that's our concept of equilibrium, right? It's when total production equals total income equals total expenditures. So equilibrium occurs when total spending equals current output. When this is the case, producers have no reason to expand or contract their output. So we're sort of in this short-run equilibrium. Because eventually, though, prices and wages can be expected at some point to change, but it could take a very long time. So we just call it a short-run equilibrium. It's not a long-run equilibrium. If total spending or demand is deficient, depressed conditions and high levels of unemployment will persist. You're just sort of stuck in a rut. If you think of the circular flow and the analogy of water going around a hose, and that's the circular flow, where you have a lower pressure, but a constant lower pressure, and it's just going around. So, you have production that becomes people's income. That's their income. They spend that. But in order to get a higher pressure, you need to have something happen. And so consumption is not just going to suddenly, out of the blue, increase, especially during the Great Depression, where you had, a significant number of people who were unemployed, but even the people who were still working especially at that time, are probably a bit traumatized and frightened to spend their money because they're worried that they might lose their job as well. And you got to remember, in those days, they didn't have any social programs at all. Well, they might have had some small things, but there's no unemployment insurance, there's no welfare, social assistance, anything like that. So you have to go line up at soup kitchens to be able to eat if you don't have a job. So it was, people were really scared and frightened. So you're kind of, you have this glutton spending, and you're in an equilibrium because firms are going to only produce, which equals people's income, which equals what people are going to spend. And all of that's at a lower level. And then if you think of business investment, so you have, aggregate expenditures or aggregate demand, is consumption and investment. Business investment spending is not, in a recession, is not going to all of a sudden pick up for no reason. It virtually collapsed in the Great Depression. So that's not going to be going anywhere. So, this is the characteristics of the Great Depression. This is what Keynes thinks was central to the story. And so if total spending is less than full employment output, inventories will rise and firms will reduce output and employment. So the lower level of output and employment will persist as long as total spending is less than output. It makes sense. There's no reason for firms to produce anything more than what people want. So total spending to Keynes was key. And he believed that the main cause of the Great Depression is weak aggregate demand. There's a deficient spending on goods and services. And so you're in this glut. How do you get out of it? And so his idea was to promote that the government plays a role and they can, by increasing their spending, stimulate the economy and get out of that situation where you have insufficient demand. And again, when the government does increase its spending, they don't have to spend by the amount that the economy is below potential GDP. If the economy's real GDP is 50 billion below potential, the government doesn't have to spend 50 billion. They can borrow and spend an amount less than that, and because of the respending effect or the multiplier effect, that will give that initial amount momentum, and it'll be magnified. So the Keynesian theory highlights the potential of fiscal policy as a tool capable of reducing fluctuations in aggregate demand. So this was actually new thinking, but now that's what they do all the time. The reason why we're having such a huge deficit, as I mentioned earlier, is because the federal government immediately increases spending to offset the fall in the economy. But back in those days, they would think you're not playing with a full deck of cards if you were to think something like that. If everyone, if the economy is doing poorly, then everyone just becomes more thrifty, including the government. So back then, the governments basically balanced their budget every year, and they didn't think that they had any role in stimulating the economy. So John Maynard Keynes argued, obviously, that the opposite, and that they should do what's called counter-cyclical policy, and that can offset fluctuations in aggregate demand. So this would imply that the government should plan budget deficits when the economy is weak and budget surpluses when strong demand threatens to cause inflation. So that's the main idea. So counter-cyclical fiscal policy is just a policy of counteracting whatever's going on in the economy. If the economy is doing very well and booming, and you have a risk of inflation, well, then the government should be running surpluses, so spending less, taking in more tax revenue, and perhaps paying off any prior debts. But if the economy is doing very poorly, it should spend and go into a deficit situation. If we look at a diagram, here we have a recessionary gap. Okay, so aggregate demand and aggregate supply are intersecting here below potential output. So we're in a recessionary gap. We're not making as much stuff as we like. And we know that over time, wages can adjust. The aggregate supply curve should shift to the right and bring us back to full employment. But that could take a very long time. So Keynes just suggested that the government increase aggregate demand through an increase in government spending to get us back to full employment output, because we don't want to wait 10 or 15 years for it to happen on its own. And we might have to put up with a bit of inflation, because this is going to end up having some higher impact on prices. But, he said it's better than just waiting. And that he had the famous quote, "In the long run, we're all dead." So the idea here is that if you're in a recession, the government should go into a deficit position. It would increase its purchases of goods and services and potentially reduce taxes. And then that will stimulate the economy and get us out of a recession. This is much easier said than done, of course. So the idea, again, is to use government spending to get us out of the recession instead of waiting. It's just another illustration. So two routes to long-run full employment equilibrium. The one, as I mentioned before, is wait for prices to adjust. And so wait for this aggregate expenditures curve to shift to the right because of falling wages. Remember, when we draw a short-run aggregate supply curve, we're drawing it for a fixed wage. If wages are lower, then at each price level, firms would want to hire more and produce more. And so that would shift the short run aggregate supply curve to the right. So we can wait for this to go to the right and have our equilibrium go back towards the long run or potential GDP. But instead, Keynes said that self-adjustment process is very lengthy and painful. It would be better just to spend money in a recession, the government to spend money, shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, and get us back to full employment that way and at a much faster pace. So we could also use this in an inflationary gap. So if we have that our short run equilibrium is to the right of potential, so this could be caused by overstimulating the economy. So that, there could be many reasons. So the government should, instead of waiting for the aggregate supply curve to shift back on its own, reduce government spending. And in this sense, they could reduce spending and even increase taxes, and then they could generate a surplus, and then they could use that to pay back debts that they incurred when they were doing the other policy in a recession. So that's the idea. It's pretty straightforward, but there are some issues with it, as we'll talk about in a moment. This is just another illustration with a little bit better animation than the one on the last slide. So I just put both for you to have for your notes. So again, instead of waiting for the economy to self-adjust, we'll just reduce government spending and get us back to our full employment equilibrium. And again, we don't like to be here. We don't like to be here. Here we have inflation. We don't like inflation has all kinds of negative aspects. We talked a bit about those before. We don't like being in a recession. Unemployment and inflation are like the two economic evils. We want to be running where we're producing at our potential. So given our human resources, our skilled labor, our natural resources, our capital, plants, everything that gives us the ability to produce goods and services, that's all related to our potential. We want to be operating at that potential, and we don't want to have unemployment so the federal budget is the primary tool of fiscal policy. So we know that. So this is just a summary. Keynesians stress the importance of counter-cyclical fiscal policy. So in a recession, we should spend our way out of it. In an inflationary situation, we should do the opposite. So in a recession, we should run a budget deficit, stimulate the economy. And then when the economy is doing good or we're worried about inflation, so for an inflationary gap, we do the opposite. And then hopefully we can manage the debt because we're going to have surpluses here that could be used for the debt that we incur when we do this policy in a recession. So we see shortcomings associated with this policy. So the one thing is that the timing isn't easy. So there could be very long time lags to enact spending I guess it seems to be a little faster these days. I don't know, but if you look at this COVID-19 crisis, they're actually very quick at passing legislation and getting checks out to people. I'm not sure if that's somewhat of a recent thing. I think it would have taken much longer in the past. Of course, we have the internet now and computers, and there's a lot of things can be done much quicker for when you're thinking of administrative type like that. But even 10 years ago, maybe 15, it would have taken a little bit longer, especially 30 years ago. But still, there can be time lags. It's possible that by the time you legislation through to increase spending, it's possible that the economy may have already recovered, and then you're going to be stimulating it at the wrong time. That's the idea with the timing. So this is referring to discretionary fiscal policy. There's two types. There's discretionary fiscal policy, which is spending that needs to be passed through Parliament. That's the idea. Whereas you have automatic stabilizers, which are automatic. So when we go into a recession, new legislation doesn't need to be passed for spending to increase on social assistance or anything like that. So that's kind of automatic. So with the automatic stabilizers, we kind of have this automatic counter-cyclical fiscal policy, but it's not big enough. So other spending needs to be done through discretionary fiscal policy. But so the idea here is if you time it wrong, you could make things worse. The whole point of this is to smooth the business cycle, right? So if the economy starts going down, we don't let it go down as much. We stimulate it and prevent it. And then if the economy is doing very well, we do the opposite. But if we get the timing wrong, we'll just exacerbate the business cycle. So if the government decides to pass a spending increase in spending plan to stimulate the economy, and by the time they do that, the economy already recovered, and then they stimulate it too much at the wrong side, you're going to make the boom cycle much larger, and then the other way around. So that's the idea here. Also, the crowding out effect could become an issue, could potentially be an issue. If you have the government borrowing a lot of money, that could potentially drive up interest rates. And we know that would have the opposite effect of what they're trying to do. They're trying to stimulate the economy. Higher interest rates will offset that. Okay, so an increase in government spending could drive up interest rates and make it harder and harder for private investors to take loans. And as a result, that would offset the initial increase or economic stimulus that the government's trying to do. So that would reduce real GDP or income. I don't think it wouldn't fully offset the initial spending from the government borrowing, but it will dampen it, right? Now, it could also have an inflationary bias because the government spending, anytime you're stimulating the economy, that could be an issue. Of course, it depends on how steep the aggregate supply curve is. And it could obviously cause very serious budget deficits, right? So as we're going to have right now. So it ignores the effect it has on the government budget. Well, not exactly entirely, but so far we just sort of said spend and run a surplus. But we'll see that what we'll see later on is counter-cyclical balanced budget fiscal policy, which is a little more clear. Okay, so these are the automatic stabilizers I was talking about before. So these are changes in spending on the part of the government that don't need to have new legislative action. So these tools will increase the budget deficit and reduce the surplus during recession, and increase the surplus to reduce the deficit during an economic boom. These are just things like unemployment insurance, social assistance, and then you also have the fact that when you go into a recession, automatically there's going to be less government revenue because people aren't working or paying taxes, and some businesses are losing money rather than making profit, so they're not paying taxes either. So what's good about these is that it's automatic, right? So they have this effect of counter-cyclical fiscal policy. So since it's counter, it's going to stabilize the business cycle, and you don't have to worry about any delays associated with legislative action. And so again, examples of automatic stabilizers are unemployment insurance, corporate profit tax, progressive income tax. So in our tax system, we don't just pay a flat tax, right? If you make $10,000 in Ontario, when you file your income tax at the end of the year and net everything out, because sometimes you get taxes taken off your paycheck, but at the end of the year, when you settle it for sure, you pay zero tax. But if you make 20,000, you still pay zero tax on the first 10,000, but you'll pay maybe something like 10% on the next 10,000. And if you make 100,000 a year and you make another 10,000, you might pay something like 40% tax on that additional income. So the tax rate goes up with the level of income. So your marginal tax rate increases. And so this means that if there's a recession, the amount of tax loss is going to be fairly high at first, but then come down. So you have this gradual stage. So anyways, these all contribute to the idea of counter-cyclical fiscal policy, except that they're automatic. But they're not very large. They're sizable amounts. But when we're talking about this COVID-19 crisis, for example, we couldn't just rely on these to have the economy stabilized, right? We needed to spend a lot of money to help all of the restaurants and retail and all of the employees of those places to maintain their income. This wouldn't obviously been large enough. So the other policy would be balanced budget fiscal policy. This would be the idea that the government should balance its spending and tax revenues each budget period. And it actually sounds attractive. Someone's asking another question about the test. So with regards to the midterm is supposed to be a closed book exam. Of course, I can't monitor that. That's obvious that I can't do that. So that's all I'm saying. So all I'm saying is don't rely on trying to learn the material the day of the midterm by using the textbook. Even if you think of looking stuff up, it's going to take you a few minutes to look something up, and you only have 2 minutes per multiple choice question. So that's all I'm saying. Okay. Someone just mentioned my slides are different than, oh, these are different than what's on Slate. Didn't know that. Okay. Can you send me an email so that I remember after class to update them? Thank you. Just this, and let me know what if it's just this chapter or was it any chapters before? So again, the idea of this policy is just every year balance the budget. Okay. So it sounds good at first, but we'll see, it has some disadvantages. So the advantages are clear. So any of the problems with counter-cyclical policy won't be an issue now. And this would just rely on the automatic stabilizers. But again, when you're thinking of this policy, you're obviously thinking then that the economy should self-adjust. So we already know from Keynes that this self-adjustment thing can take time. So this is the big issue right here. So yeah, there are some arguments for this. One of the big arguments a lot of people will say is that people themselves in a market system can better make decisions on how to allocate our scarce resources in the economy, and that the government is not good at doing that. But there's argument. You could take it either way. That is true. It's also true though that we don't want people living through a Great Depression like in the 1930s for 10 or 15 years. You can imagine all of the misery that people endured. So it's a debate. It's not it's not a simple answer, yes or no, or which policy is perfect. There's a lot of, if you weigh the costs and benefits, I think, and it depends on your government. If you have a prudent government that's, fairly organized, that's prudent, it may not, counter-cyclical fiscal policy is probably not too bad of an idea. It all depends. But a lot of people will say this is good because we don't want the government having a debt. But it's not that simple. If the government decides to have a balanced budget fiscal policy, well then what will happen in a recession? So in a recession, because of automatic stabilizers, the economy will automatically go into more of a deficit situation, right? And so if we're saying we always balance the budget, just think of, okay, so last year we've balanced the budget, okay? So we don't have a deficit or surplus and we're debt free. So we've been running this policy forever. Now let's say we go into a recession. Well, if we go into a recession, we're going to get less tax revenues because of people being unemployed, not as many people paying taxes, not as many taxes are going to be collected from businesses because they're going to be not making as much profit. And then also we're going to be putting out some more money for things like employment insurance and social assistance. So then you're automatically going to have a deficit. So this policy would say that the government should cut spending, make sure it doesn't go into a deficit position. Well, that'll make the recession even worse. And then that's going to make the deficit even worse. And then they're going to have to cut again. So it's, it could do a lot of damage to the economy, this type of policy. Okay, so this would tend to push the economy in the same direction that it's leaning in. So it'll make recessions worse. And if we're in a period of a boom period where inflation's a concern, and we're going to more likely run a surplus because we're going to get a lot of tax revenues, okay? And we're not going to be spending as much on social assistance and things like that, on employment insurance. And so this policy would say that we should spend that money because we want to only, we want the balance to always be zero. So then we're saying the government's going to stimulate the economy when it's already overstimulated. That's going to make it even worse. So again, this would make the business cycle even more pronounced. Someone's asking if the midterm is going to be web monitored. No, I'm not going to use the web monitoring, so don't worry about that. So in this question here, it's asking us, suppose that the government increases both its own spending and autonomous taxes by $100, and the economy's multiplier equals 3. If consumers spend 75% of their disposable after-tax income, by how much will GDP change? Okay, so let's look at this. So we're going to increase government spending by 100. Then we know because of the multiplier that'll blow up into 300. And then autonomous taxes, if they were to increase by 100, then consumption's only going to fall by 75. That's because we were going to give the other 25% to the government anyways. So then the multiplier effect would decrease GDP by 225. And so the net effect would actually be a $75 increase in GDP. So if the government increases its own spending and taxes by the same amount, they don't fully offset each other. And that's because when the government spends money, that injection is immediately into the circular flow, the full amount. So think of that 100 immediately being injected into the circular flow. But if you increase taxes, when you change taxes, you have to remember the other portion is going to be saved. Sorry, I said taxed over here earlier, but it's saved. So because, so if the government decided to instead cut taxes by the same amount, well, then a portion of that wasn't going to be spent anyways. It would have been saved. So that initial injection in the circular flow will be less. Okay, that's the idea of this question. Okay, so the last policy here is cyclically balanced budget fiscal policy. So this is the basic idea here is the same as before. It's same as this is the same as before. It's like counter-cyclical fiscal policy, but we're aiming to balance the budget over the business cycle. So it's kind of like a hybrid of the other two policies. So in a recession, we're going to run a deficit, stimulate the economy by spending. But in an inflationary or boom period, we're going to run a surplus. And so we should, the idea here then is to ensure that over the whole business cycle that the surplus is enough to pay off the debt. And so over the whole business cycle, instead of a year, we balance the budget. And here's just a side note. So there's something called a cyclical versus a structural deficit. So a structural deficit is a deficit that would exist even if the economy is at full employment GDP. So basically there's some kind of an issue with the public sector, like in Greece or something, where at some point they promised jobs for life for all of the government employees so they couldn't get fired. So that could lead to something like this, where you just have so many commitments that even if the economy is fully stimulated, you're at full employment, you're still having this deficit. So that's what a structural deficit would be. A cyclical deficit is just a result of the business cycle. So the fluctuation in aggregate demand, the regular business cycle, that's what's causing this deficit. So a cyclical deficit is equal to the actual deficit minus the structural deficit. So the shortcomings of a cyclically balanced budget fiscal policy is that there's no guarantee that the size and length of the recession and the inflationary gap are going to be enough so that you can offset the deficit and surplus. So another issue is just politics. So you could end up with maybe a structural deficit because increasing government spending in bad times is politically easy, but decreasing government spending in good times is politically hard, right? And politicians are the ones that make these decisions, not necessarily economists. So you could have cyclical deficits turn into structural deficits. That seems like what may have happened in the 70s and 80s. Also the business cycles rarely match political cycles. So governments blame earlier governments for debts. There's lots of issues with the politics as well. You can see how the incentives, what's good for the economy, what's good for politics may not always line up. So let's go back to our national debt. We're just going to do some exercises to see how bad our debt is. So, with the exception of lately, I'll try to put it in context to now because this is older data, but let's just consider before the COVID-19 events what things look like. So we know that in 2015 we had a debt of 612 billion. And again, this is only the federal government. There's also a lot of debt in the provinces as well, which we didn't talk about, but you can add, especially Ontario, there's a lot of debt that we would be adding to this as well if we wanted to look at provincial and federal. But anyways, we're just looking at federal. So this was the debt. So, is it really that? So I guess I'll rephrase the question. Is the debt we had in 2015, is it really all that bad? Well, let's look at debt as a percentage of GDP. This is a much better measure. So you can't, like, if I just told you someone's name and that they had $100,000 in debt, would you be able to say that's good or bad? You probably have a tendency to say that it's bad because most people that would be bad. But I didn't tell you this person's income. If Bill Gates had $100,000 debt, that would be laughable. It's not a big deal. So it's a similar idea here. When you talk about the debt of a country, you want to talk about it in the context of its income as well. So if the United States had a debt of $1 trillion, that's actually quite good. But if Canada had a debt of 1 trillion, that's much worse, right? And that's because the economies are much different in sizes, which also means their incomes are much different. So the GDP is essentially our income. And so a good measure of how bad the debt is would be to look at the debt relative to GDP, because GDP is essentially the income of the country. And that's, creditors would, when they're thinking of giving loans, or banks, when they're thinking of giving loans, one of the ratios they'll look at is, the debt or the money you want to borrow relative to your income. So if we look at Canada in 1926, our debt to GDP ratio was 47%. It was 49% in 1940. And then it was 113%. This was from the war in 1946. 1967, it was only 23%. In 1991, it was 60%. And then in 2015, it was 31%. So actually, since 1995, I don't know about all of the years, but we had one of the lowest GDP to debt to GDP ratios of the G8. So we, up to 2015 at least, we're doing quite well. So another way we can look at this is looking at nominal and real GDP figures. So here is the net national debt in 1926, 1940, 1946, 1967, 1991, and 2013. So if we look, wow, this looks really bad compared to 1926. But can I really say anything about how bad this debt is compared to that with just this information? This is just nominal GDP in every one of those years. The answer is no, I have no idea. Because first of all, these aren't adjusted for prices. And so let's look at that. And then also, we don't know what the population is, or you can also think of it would be good to also know how bad this is relative to the income of the country or per capita. So let's look at the per capita net national debt in nominal terms. So if I were to take these figures and divide them by the population, I would get how much each person owes on average. And so when we do that, they don't look as bad, actually. If you look at 1991 and 2013, this looks much worse than this. But then if we scale it by the population, the difference isn't as pronounced. And so this debt increased quite a lot between 1991 and 2013. But at the same time, the population increased by a heck of a lot as well. So there's more people to pay it back. So we can, that's one thing that you need to look at is per capita. And then of course we also need to adjust for prices. So if I just take this first row here and then adjust these into 2007 dollars, then we have real GDP. So this is real GDP in each of, the debt in real terms in each of these years. Okay, and so we see, first of all, once we have everything with constant prices, if you look at this compared to this, it's certainly nowhere near as bad as that, but still quite bad. But what we really want to look at is per capita net national debt in real terms. And then we do that, we get this series of numbers here. So for sure, the debt in 2013 is quite, it's relative, it's not the best year, but it's actually not so bad as in 1991. It's actually improved when we incorporate prices and per capita population growth. And, it's a little bit worse than in 1946. So looking at just the debt numbers in nominal terms over time, or just even a number on its own, doesn't really tell you much unless you want to divide it by the population. If you're just looking at one particular period to know, what are we talking about? How many people live in this country? So that's one thing you want to do. And then if you're comparing over time, you want to make sure you have it adjusted for inflation as well. And then we already looked at this, but of course, percentage of GDP is much better to look at too. You want to divide it by the gross domestic product. And actually, this is a little bit dated now, but these are debt to GDP ratios for other countries. So a few years ago, Greece was very high at 155%. Japan's quite high. France is quite high. I think Italy is quite high as well. So like if we're looking at our figure, we're doing much better than some of these other countries. So actually, this is maybe so I added this recently. This is somewhat recently, 2017. So this stat I have for Japan is extremely high at 237%. Then we see Greece is really bad, Italy, France. Oh, I think this is including provincial debt as well, maybe, because Canada's is really high. Anyways, I'll have to update these slides, but you get the idea. So finish up doing a quick question before we end the lecture today. So we are given the figures below, and they show the aggregate demand and supply and the government budget line for the economy of Mahadi. The economy is presently at equilibrium, and then we're told for every $1 change in government spending, aggregate demand changes by $3. Can someone type in the chat what that information is telling us? Anyone? So if the government increases its spending by $1, that aggregate demand will change by 3. Yes, that's right. So it's the multiplier. Okay, so what is the present level of GDP and the price level in Mahadi? Anyone want to type that in the chat? Yep, so it's 120 and 1200. Okay, so we're at this point. Okay. Is there a recessionary or inflationary gap? And how much? So one thing to notice, this is our long run aggregate supply curve. So this is drawn at potential GDP, right? So yep, we're in a recessionary gap of 400. Okay. Now, does this government have a budget deficit or surplus? How much? So how do we find that? Well, we're going to go down to our budget line, and we see that if the real GDP is 1200, this economy is going to have a budget deficit of 200, right? So deficit, and the amount is 200 to write on this. How much must aggregate demand increase or decrease in order to move the economy to full employment income? So what we're asking is basically how far would this aggregate demand curve have to shift to the right so that it intersects at this point? So if the aggregate demand curve shifted just 4 boxes, then we would be 1, 2, 3, 4. We would be here, 1, 2, 3, 4 here, and then we would end up going through here, right? So a way to do it is to look at where you want it to intersect. We want the aggregate demand curve to intersect here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 boxes. So if we shifted it over 6 boxes, we will be at the aggregate demand curve will go through here. So I'll just put a couple more points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there'll be a point there. point here. So, and then I'll just put one down here. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So here, and so this will be the aggregate demand curve. This would be if we had the curve shift over by 6 boxes, and 6 boxes is what? It's 600, right? So let me just see if I can delete that. So we drew the new demand curve, and so we know that aggregate demand had to increase by 600. So now it's saying what change in government spending is necessary in order to move the economy to full employment equilibrium. Okay, so I'll give you a moment to think about that. So how much government spending is needed to shift this aggregate demand curve by 600? Perfect, that's right. So we know the multiplier is 3, right? Because we're told at the beginning of the question, for every $1 change in government spending, aggregate demand changes by 3. So if the government increases spending by 200, through the multiplier effect, it'll increase real GDP by, increase it by 6, the full 600. Okay, so what effect will this have on the level of GDP and the price level? So we know that the price level is going to go from 120 to 140. Okay, so now so if the government makes the change in F, draw the new budget line labeled BL2. So if you remember, will the budget line shift down or up? So we have an increase of government spending by 200. Will the budget line shift up or down? Remember, the budget line was net revenues minus G. So at any point here, we're going to be subtracting a larger number, right? So then this is going to fall. Yeah, it'll go down by 200. Okay, so there'll be a point here, there'll be a point here, here, and this will be the new budget line, BL2. Now, the questions ask, and so what will be the new value of the government's budget at this new GDP? So again, we look down and we're going to go to our budget line, see that it'll be at negative 200, right? So now it's telling us to return to the original equilibrium. And suppose that the government is committed to a balanced budget, okay? What change in government spending is necessary in order to balance the budget at the present level? So again, we're back here, okay? We know our deficit was negative 200, right? So what would the government here have to do in order to balance the budget? So we'll just say that they're going to reduce government spending, okay? We'll just keep the thing simple and just say they can change the government spending. Let's just keep it simple and just say they can change the government spending. So they're going to want to reduce government spending, right? They're going to want to reduce it by 200. So if they do that, then we're going to draw the new budget line. So the new budget line in this case will shift or down. It's going to be the opposite of this because this shifted down when we increase government spending. Now we're going to reduce it. So the budget line will shift up. So that's the new budget line. And then it says, what effect will the change in K have on aggregate demand? So we know that when the government increased spending by 200, the real GDP increased by 600. So if the government reduces spending by 200, by the way, the multiplier effect works in reverse. So in this case, that would reduce aggregate demand by 600. And so the aggregate demand curve will shift over by 6 boxes. Shift this over by 6 boxes, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left, right? Now, so this is AD3. Again, these solutions are posted. I know these are a little messy. So there's a clean solution posted. That's our new aggregate demand curve. And then it says, as a result of this change in aggregate demand, what will happen to the value of GDP and the price level? So the price level will fall to 100 and GDP will fall to 800. So again, we were at the initial position where we were in a recession already, okay? And we had a deficit of negative 200. And the government decided to cut spending to balance the budget, okay? And so because of that, aggregate demand shifted to the left, and now we're in a worse recession. And then as a result of this change in aggregate demand, what would happen to the value of GDP? Okay, so we already answered N. The last question says, what's the new value of the government's budget at this new GDP? Surprise, surprise. We go down to the budget line, it's still negative 200. So the government tried to balance its budget. It made the recession worse, and they still have a deficit. And that's because net tax revenues move with real GDP. So, this is of course a hypothetical example, but it clearly illustrates the fallacy of having a balanced budget every single year. In this case, it made the economy even worse. And they still never got rid of the deficit, because when you make the economy worse, further decreases in taxes and increases in automatic stabilizer payments are going to happen. So, it didn't, it had the unintended consequences where it made the recession even worse. Okay, so that's good for today. Does anyone have any more questions?
So can you explain me back to how to get the 6 boxes?
So for every $1 change in government spending, aggregate demand changes by 3. So if the government, so if you're talking about D, clear the screen here, figure out how to do that. So I'll shut it off and then turn it back on. So D, we're here. We know that we want to be here, right? So we were asked by how much aggregate demand would increase or decrease in order to move the economy to full employment. So where is full employment? Full employment's here, right? We want the aggregate demand curve to intersect with the aggregate supply curve at this point. So how many boxes would we need to shift the aggregate demand curve over? Well, we know we want this to be intersecting right here, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Whoops, what happened there? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's where it would intersect the aggregate supply curve, and we would be back at full employment. Does that make sense?
It's clear now. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to look at Paulina's question here. It lets me, how does it rotate this? Okay, so in this question we have nominal GDP increased by 12%, real GDP increased by 5%. Okay, so this is that's a previous question. So we have a table here. We have our nominal GDP, real GDP deflator, real GDP, population. And so Paulina, do you want to turn on the mic and just let me know what the issue is here?
Yeah, so pretty much for the year 2017, so in the original question, the nominal GDP and the real GDP were blank, and those are the figures we had to find. But based on the formulas for all of these, I couldn't figure out how to get either or in order to get there.
So, well, we know that, so real GDP per capita, we know is just real GDP. So it doesn't show it here, but it's real GDP divided by the population, right? So see if I can annotate here. So, I'm going to put real GDP per capita is just real GDP population. So per capita, which we know is 28,390. Okay. And we know that population is 31. So this equals 31. So then real GDP should just be 28,390, right? 31. Is that correct? You'll be able to get nominal GDP. Can anyone still hear me? I don't know if my internet went out.
No, I can hear you. So that when you do that, it's 880,090.
Where's the answer that it's saying it should be? Oh, 880.
Right there. So the answers are the bolded ones. Yeah. So those are the bolded answers. I couldn't figure them out.
Sorry. 390. I think it's just okay. Yeah. So it's the same. Yeah. So that's how you do it. The only issue is that I don't know where in the question, but this is obviously measured then in maybe thousands or no. Oh, you know what? I bet you this is measured in. I bet you if you do 28390, and then if you multiply it by 0.31, you get 880. So I think this is maybe in millions and then this is in billions. It's something to do with that. So, but yeah, I don't see anywhere where they said that. So, if this was on a test or something, you'd be able to justify getting full marks, right? If you did this calculation, you would get the full marks because it doesn't say that, for all we know, these are all measured in the same units, but it looks like they're measured in different units, but I don't see anywhere where they say that, right? So, yeah, so that's what it is. So, real GDP is this, the population's that. Real GDP per capita then is equal to what you're given. So then real GDP has to be the population multiplied by the real GDP per capita. But there's just some issue with the units not being told or something, right? If the population's in billions and then that's in millions, then you would, to make these in common units, you would just divide this by 1,000 or 100, or you divide it by 1,000. We did it just 0.31. So this is, I don't know. There's something with the units here. That's all it is. Yeah. Other than that, so once you have this, then that's the deflator. So then we know real divided by, or nominal divided by real is equal to that.
Yeah.
Right? So then we can figure out the rest. Is that clear now?
Yeah, no, that's clear. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, everyone. So we'll see you bright and early Friday morning at 8 a.m. Study hard. Make sure you try and master the material the best you can. Good night's rest, and we'll see you on Friday. Any questions, you can send me an email. Take care. And I'll post this video afterwards. I posted the last one on Slate already, by the way. So I record them and then I post them. Okay, have a good night. Take care.